Combat has always been an intrinsic element of the Assassin's Creed game, even when it's not been the #1 priority. Each game has stood out with a combat mechanic unique to its style and atmosphere, and due to this ever-changing and evolving element of the series, the combat systems have been inconsistent in quality over the years. The question I'm here to ask is which of the games had the best combat mechanic and which was the worst? Before we get into the video, make sure to hit like, and if you're new here, hit subscribe with post notifications turned on. With all that being said, let's rank the combat systems of Assassin's Creed. The combat system in Assassin's Creed Syndicate, released in 2015, is often criticised as one of the weakest in the series, and to me it is the single worst, with several factors contributing to its lackluster experience. One of the main criticisms of the combat in Syndicate is its lack of challenge. The enemy AI is often regarded as simplistic and predictable, failing to provide a significant threat to the player. This results in combat encounters that feel too easy and lacking in strategic depth, robbing the player's sense of accomplishment and excitement. The combat system in Syndicate also suffers from a lack of variety, as players have access to a limited set of moves and techniques which quickly become repetitive and fail to keep the gameplay engaging over time. The lack of diverse enemy types and encounters further contribute to a monotonous combat experience. The game attempted to streamline the combat mechanics to make them more accessible, but this resulted in oversimplification. The removal of features such as counter kills and the introduction of a single button combat system reduced the complexity and strategic decision making that had been present in previous games. This simplified, infantilized approach stripped away the depth and nuance that fans had come to expect from the series. The combat in Syndicate also often lacks a sense of impact and weight. The animations and sound design fail to convey the weightiness of strikes and impacts, resulting in combat that feels floaty and less satisfying, almost like a cartoon. This diminishes the immersion and tactile feedback that players typically look for in a combat system. Syndicate is widely regarded as one of the weakest games in the series, and its absolutely terrible combat system is a big part of that. And while the game does definitely have strengths that could be mentioned, combat isn't one of them. The combat in Assassin's Creed 3 was a big change for the series, and it was one that fell flat. While the game introduces new features and a unique setting, the combat experience fell short in several areas, leaving much to be desired. One of the major drawbacks of the combat in AC3 is its lack of responsiveness. The controls can feel unresponsive and imprecise, resulting in frustrating moments where players struggle to execute the desired actions. This lack of precision hampers the overall enjoyment of combat encounters, making it difficult to perform precise attacks or counters. And instead, the player has to rely on chained animations that can't be broken under any circumstances. The combat animations in AC3 also contribute to the overall disappointment. Although visually they're mocapped beautifully and they are quite stylish, they're also slow, sluggish, and feel far too locked in. Enemy AI in AC3 is another area of concern. Opponents often exhibit predictable behaviour and limited tactics, failing to provide a significant challenge. This lack of intelligent adversaries diminishes the excitement and strategic depth in combat encounters, resulting in repetitive and unengaging battles. This combat system also suffers from a severe lack of variety. Whilst the game introduces new weapons such as the tomahawk and the rope dart, once you have these weapons, you're never really given anything else to play with, meaning that from the start of Connor's journey to the end, you never really have any reason to switch up your combat tactics. Although AC3 made massive pushes forward in terms of animation capturing, the combat system itself as a playable experience just isn't one that's satisfying enough to get it any higher on this list. Black Flag. Black Flag and Assassin's Creed 3 obviously have very similar combat mechanics, and whilst it could be argued that Assassin's Creed 3's is slightly more precise, Black Flag added more variety to the game and also more combat situations that switch up the atmosphere of each interaction. Although Black Flag still has that simplicity and shallowness to it, the pirate element of the game adds a lot that was desired in Assassin's Creed 3. In other words, the combat systems between Black Flag and AC3 are basically the same, but the pirate fantasy adds another element to Black Flag that creates intrinsic player motivation to, be a cool pirate. Boarding an enemy ship as a pirate and slicing through tens of guards to capture it is just an experience that can't be mirrored in any other game. So Black Flag gets just above AC3 but doesn't get much higher. The combat system in Rogue shares similarities with its predecessor, however it incorporates some notable additions and refinements. The game's combat system emphasises the naval battles I mentioned earlier and close quarters combat on land, offering a blend of strategic gameplay and dynamic action. Although once again it is the same base mechanic, Rogue incorporates a vast variety of new weapons, and once again encourages combat in more encounters. Players have access to a wider range of weapons, including swords, pistols, and hidden blades, but most particularly Shay's air rifle, which can be used to deliver long-range and stealthy attacks. The enemy AI in Rogue was also enhanced compared to previous entries, with enemies displaying slightly improved tactics and coordination, especially when you encounter assassin sneak attacks in the middle of a combat encounter. On top of that, there's also the specific Assassin Hunter missions, in which players can face off against skilled assassins sent to eliminate Shay, which really allows the system to emphasize the counter and parry mechanic that to this point was perfected. Of course, the combat system is still fairly bare bones, however, Rogue does the best out of this trilogy. The combat system in Revelations built upon the mechanics established by its predecessor AC Brotherhood, however, I would argue it took a slight step down from that game. For one big particular reason. Of course, Revelations puts the player back in the shoes of Ezio Auditore, who has further honed his combat skills as he's grown into older age. The combat system retains the core mechanics of the previous games while introducing new abilities and some new weapons. The core combat mechanics revolve around a combination of attacking, countering, and defensive moves. Players can engage in hand-to-hand combat using a variety of weapons, including swords, daggers, and throwing knives. Timing is of course key, as successful counters allow Ezio to seamlessly eliminate enemies with a swift and lethal strike. And after one kill, Revelations, just like Brotherhood, incorporates the kill streak mechanic, in which you can continue on slicing through enemies with just a single press of the attack button. An addition which I personally have always absolutely despised, as it completely simplified down the mechanic that was introduced in Assassin's Creed 1. However, what really brings Revelations down in this department is the slow motion. It's as simple as that. Revelations and Brotherhood, for all intents and purposes, have the same combat mechanic. However, every single combat encounter in Revelations ends with a slow motion kill animation. And although this is cool the first 1, 2, 3 times you do it, when you're 10 hours into the game, it feels like a complete waste of time, and it hurts the soul to see the same animation for the 500th time in slow motion. So Revelations sits below Brotherhood on this list. As I mentioned before, the combat in Brotherhood also built upon the foundations of AC1 and AC2, however it introduced that refined and so-called fluid combat experience that incorporated the kill streak as the main focus of the game. The clear intention of the kill streak was to turn Ezio into more of a glass cannon that was able to shred through enemies with ease. However, the fact that the player's health is still consistently so high in these games means that that glass cannon element kind of goes away, and the player just becomes a completely indestructible god. That being said, the kill streak is still a lot of fun, and when a skilled player balances counters, the kill streak, and the hidden gun, it can create a very satisfying experience. That being said, for 99% of players, the Brotherhood combat mechanic kind of just comes down to pressing X over and over and over and over again. On top of all this, Brotherhood also made every enemy counterable, removing the entire point of enemy variety in the first place. Brutes, captains, and guards with spears can all be one-hit countered, with the papal guards being the only real difficult challenge in the game, and considering they're only encountered maybe 5 or 6 times throughout the main story, it really diminishes the challenge that was present in prior games. Brotherhood's saving grace is of course the fact that it was built on the foundations of the first game, however it definitely made some negative additions. The combat system in Odyssey introduces significant changes and enhancements compared to previous entries in the series. It offered a more expansive and RPG-focused combat experience with a wide range of abilities, weapons, and customization options. And here I'm going to try my very best to remove my bias. Because regardless of whether you prefer the RPG games or the classic Assassin games, it's hard to deny that the RPG games did improve on the combat mechanic. Of course, there were downsides, and of course, it didn't necessarily match up to the Assassin fantasy. However, Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla did make combat a priority, and they made it far more in depth. Odyssey, however, did this far and away the worst. This combat system placed a stronger emphasis on player progression, allowing for supposed greater customization and specialization. However, too often, especially considering the game was level locked, that led to combat encounters being tedious sludges through enemy health bars, repeatedly slicing away at the same guard over and over again for minutes on end. Sure, if you put all of your experience into the branch of the warrior tree, you can make combat a somewhat enjoyable experience that isn't tedious. However, when a mechanic forces a player to play a game in a certain way, especially a game that was advertised based on the idea of player choice, that system has a clear and glaring problem. That being said, Odyssey also made some positive additions, including the special abilities known as overpower attacks, which were powerful moves that can be unleashed after building up adrenaline during combat. The other special abilities were also interesting additions, although I really think that they mastered them in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I will not deny that Assassin's Creed Odyssey's combat has major issues as an RPG and as a game as a whole, and it has even more issues in terms of the Assassin's Creed element of it. However, for a player looking for an enjoyable and challenging combat experience, they're going to find it in Odyssey before they're going to find it in Brotherhood, and that's just the honest truth. The combat in Unity is perhaps the most unique in the series, as it underwent significant changes compared to previous entries in the series. Eliminating the counters and the kill streaks that became far too prevalent in the games, it aimed to provide a more challenging and strategic combat experience with a greater emphasis on player skill and timing, more akin to Assassin's Creed 1. One of the key features of the combat system was the inclusion of parrying and disarming instead of counter. Players could block and semi-counter enemy attacks by timing their parries correctly, and successful parries would leave opponents vulnerable, enabling the player to perform devastating counterattacks that weren't automated. Disarming enemies involved breaking their defense and taking their weapon, using it against them or throwing it back as a projectile. The enemy AI in Unity also took a massive step up, as it aimed to make opponents more challenging by having them attack in groups, surround the player and execute more advanced combat maneuvers. Gone were the days of a single enemy attacking you at a time, and this made, especially in the early portions of the game, fighting against massive groups of enemies almost impossible. This difficulty curve actively encouraged the assassin fantasy of running away and of prioritizing stealth, and for that, Unity definitely gets a step up on the list. But one of the key elements of what made the Unity's combat stand out was the fact that it simultaneously encouraged the assassin fantasy whilst also being engaging in itself. The player could choose to play stealthily or choose to run in and fight, and both of those options became engaging, as opposed to the Kenway trilogy that came before it that presented combat as always the best approach. The combat in AC Unity offered a more intricate and skill-based experience, requiring players to master timing, parrying, weapon selection, and enemy interaction to overcome challenging opponents. It aimed to provide a more immersive and realistic combat feel within the historical setting of revolutionary France, and I think it did it near enough perfectly. I'm going to be brief here because Assassin's Creed 2 essentially has the same combat mechanic as Assassin's Creed 1, only with a couple of downgrades. The combo kill from Assassin's Creed 1 was made less satisfying and more tedious, as it forced the player to hit an enemy multiple times before doing a kill animation, and you could argue that the counter windows in Assassin's Creed 2 were made too wide, simplifying down the system and creating a clear meta. However, these were very minor changes, and on a whole, AC2 stayed entirely loyal to what Assassin's Creed 1 set up. The combat system of the original Assassin's Creed game is one of my favourite of all time. It focused on a relatively simple and methodical approach to combat, emphasising timing, counters, and distance management. In every encounter, the player could utilise a combination of swordplay and stealth maneuvers to manipulate the guards to their will. Combat in Assassin's Creed primarily involved engaging groups of enemies and dispatching them using a mix of defensive and offensive tactics. When facing multiple foes, players had the option to enter into a defensive stance, which allowed Altair to block oncoming attacks. By timing their blocks correctly, players could perform counterattacks that would swiftly incapacitate enemies with a single strike, but wouldn't necessarily kill them. And the counter windows on these counterattacks were ridiculously small, meaning timing and precision were crucial for executing successful counters. And engaging in a counter was a risk, as if you didn't match the counter window, you would lose synchronization. The counter window also changed depending on which weapon you were using, and if you tried to engage in combat with the hidden blade, it became ridiculously difficult to counter any attack, giving the player extra extrinsic motivation to get better at the game. The sword was the primary weapon of Altair, and by utilising the combo kill system, the player could strike through numerous enemies at a time. This mechanic involved attacking twice. The first time to take the enemy off guard and break their defense, the second time just at the moment of impact between the swords, which would then trigger an execution animation. This combo kill would also become more effective the more you used it in a combat encounter, as guards would lose morale as they saw their brother-in-arms being cut down, until eventually the final few would flee, hoping to keep their lives. Although the game placed most of its importance on stealth and assassinations, and encouraged players to avoid open conflicts whenever possible, the combat system captured the essence of the assassin fantasy in combat, with a methodical and deliberate combat experience that prioritized getting through guards above anything else. It was a functional system, not a stylish one, and it is one of my favourite in the entirety of games as a medium. The combat in Assassin's Creed Origins underwent a significant overhaul, and it introduced a more dynamic skill-based combat experience with an emphasis on player choice, weapon variety, and tactical engagement. Origins returned to a combat system that featured a hitbox-based mechanic, introducing a more realistic approach to battle. It relied on precise timing, positioning, and player skill rather than relying solely on scripted animation. The player has access to a wide array of weapons, including swords, spears, axes, and bows, each with their own unique attributes and combat style. Different weapon types offer distinct advantages and playstyles, encouraging players to experiment and find their preferred approach. One of the key elements in Origins combat is the introduction of a shield. Shields can be used for both offense and defense, allowing players to block incoming attacks, stagger enemies, and counter-attack with precision. The shield adds a layer of strategy and defensive element, giving players the ability to control the pace of the combat. Origins also introduced a varied skill tree system, offering players the ability to unlock and upgrade a wide range of combat abilities, including special moves, combo attacks, and advanced techniques. Enemy AI in Origins was more sophisticated, with opponents showcasing different attack patterns, strengths, and weaknesses. Some enemies required specific tactics or approaches to defeat, adding depth and challenge to the combat encounters, without just giving the enemies massive health bars. Origins also introduced the adrenaline gauge that I mentioned in Odyssey, and the powerful special attacks and devastating finishers it included were visually striking elements to battle. Origins offered a more skill-based experience than its prior games, and it was the first game in the series that really prioritized engaging, challenging combat as its main focus. And although I didn't love that direction for the series, it definitely paid off in terms of the combat system. Wow, a lot of people are not going to be happy with me about this one. However, the combat in Valhalla offered a visceral and brutal experience, and it reflected the Viking setting of the game. Yes, it wasn't the assassin fantasy, it was a Viking fantasy. And it was a fucking good one. Valhalla presented a system that was similar to the Origins combat mechanic. It presented a dual wielding system that allowed the player to wield a variety of weapons simultaneously. Players could choose from a wide range of weapons, including axes, swords, shields, spears, and even flails. Once again, each weapon had its own unique movesets and characteristics, providing diverse gameplay options. One of the other notable additions in Valhalla was the introduction of weapon perks, which could be upgraded and customized with runes, which granted additional abilities and effects. These perks could enhance damage output, introduce elemental effects, or provide other combat advantages, allowing players to tailor their weapons to suit their preferred playstyle. The combat was also the first in the series to introduce a stamina mechanic, something that is intrinsic to so many fantastic combat systems, and it's honestly a shock that it took 13 years for that to be introduced. Actions such as blocking, dodging, and heavy attacks consumed stamina, requiring players to manage their resources strategically. Timing played a crucial role, as successful parries and well-timed dodges could create openings for devastating counterattacks. Valhalla also placed a strong emphasis on rhythm-based combat. Players are encouraged to time their attacks with precision, chaining together combinations for maximum damage. Successful attacks filled up the adrenaline gauge, which was still there from Origins, and that combined with the special abilities created some truly devastating finishers. On top of all that, Valhalla encouraged combat perhaps more than any game in the series, especially with its large-scale battles like the assaults and sieges, where players would lead their Viking raiding parties in epic clashes against fortified locations. I can't believe I just said the word epic. These battles incorporated a combination of melee combat, ranged attacks, and siege weaponry, adding a grand-scale element to the game's combat experience. Does Assassin's Creed Valhalla fit the assassin fantasy in any way? No. Does it fit the identity of the series in any way? No. But I can't deny that Valhalla offers a perfect blend of brutal and fast-paced combat that provides the player with a varied and engaging experience throughout their entire Viking adventure. It's just a shame that it's part of Assassin's Creed. So there we have it. The combat systems from the Assassin's Creed series ranked from worst to best. I'm sure plenty of people will agree with me here, and I'm sure plenty more will disagree with me. So let me know what you think about my list in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit like, and if you're new here, hit subscribe with post notifications turned on. And with all that being said, I've been Joe, aka Found a Scarab, and I will see you in the next one.